more than 11 years, Daniel Ortega has governed Nicaragua without major checks and balances. But on April 16, an executive order to overhaul public pensions changed this course and perhaps the country's political future.
Una serie de ajustes requeridos significan esfuerzos compartidos por los pensionados, los trabajadores, los empleadores privados.
In result, those most affected by the measure and a group of young students decided to peacefully protest against the reform. As in other occasions, the government responded with brutal force, and police ammunition was used on unarmed demonstrators. Daniel Ortega's initial response only added fuel to the fire. The protest sprang across a country that has been relatively calm in a volatile region. The government made its best effort to stop the public from finding out what was happening by taking several media organizations offline. After 4 days of protests, government repression led to more than 39 deaths, according to local human rights groups. A comparable event to the war against Somoza's dictatorship.
Revoca, aparta la resolución 1317 del 16 de abril del año 2018.
Even after the government backtracked on the pension reforms, the unrest intensified, suggesting that the reform was only one of the public's demands. People who did not participate in the protest turned in to help and express solidarity. Criminal acts like looting supermarkets and stores were rejected and condemned by the general population. Religious leaders also supported and encouraged the students' protest. Some Sandinista leaders are also taking distance from the government's response.
Porque llegan uno, por muy simpatizantes del gobierno, a atacar a quienes sencillamente están de manera pacífica diciendo no estoy de acuerdo con la medida del INS. Y eso va generando una bola de nieve.
People tear down the ubiquitous government propaganda, including the tin metal trees of life erected by the First Lady. Nicaraguans in various parts of the world also demonstrated in favor of democracy in their country. On April 23rd, hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans marched through the streets without fear and shouting, "Daniel and Somoza are the same." The president pulled the police off the streets, and for the first time in years, civilians were not attacked. The government raised censorship and released a group of more than 200 protesters in prison.
Nosotros estamos abiertos a escuchar cualquier planteamiento. Es un principio elemental en el diálogo.
The religious leaders accepted the government's invitation to dialogue, but with some reservations.
El diálogo que en este momento se ha planteado es un riesgo grande para toda la nación. Este diálogo tiene que tener como objetivo la democratización de Nicaragua.
Nicaraguans continue to protest. They no longer instill a dialogue with the bishops and different social actors. It's very difficult to know what is going to happen, but if there is one thing certain, is that since April 2018, the government of Daniel Ortega knows that he is no longer untouchable, and that Nicaraguans are determined to fight for peace, democracy, and justice.
That it? Well, welcome all here today. It's an incredibly large crowd we have. I was just asking when the last time the dialogue did an event on Nicaragua, and neither Manuel or I could quite remember when the last time was. So we understand why we have such a large audience to catch everybody up. But we really have two really terrific analysts with us today to tell us what's going on in Nicaragua and where it might lead. Difficult to predict, as the film said. Let me sort of welcome most Cristiana Chamorro, who I've known for many, many years over, and she's been a columnist at La Prensa, the Nicaragua's largest newspaper. I guess you sit on the board of that newspaper now. And she also founded the Violeta Chamorro Foundation, which is a nonprofit civil society group devoted to democracy and freedom of the press. And we're delighted you could join us today. This is very, very exciting to have you here, and thank you for coming. And Manuel Orozco doesn't need any introduction, and he's not going to get one. Just let's say, I think all of you should read his article in the New York Times today on Nicaragua, where he makes a couple of interesting proposals. Let me just, what you might not have known is that he is also a political analyst, besides being a terrific commentator on migration and remittances and the like. And you might not have known, or at least some of you might know, that he's also Nicaraguan by birth. Let me say that looking around, I don't think I have to introduce this topic at all here today. I think everybody has been following it, at least everybody that I recognize, I know, knows quite a bit of what's happened. We've seen the short film, so I'm going to really turn it over to our two guests here today and let them give their interpretation of events. Let me just say, I think, as I thought about this, Christina, you can answer this. This is a general question, but, who are the protesters? In other words, how do you describe them? I mean, the newspapers consistently talk about university students. If it's just university students, that doesn't sound all that impressive. So is there more to it, or is it, are sort of a lot of people going to universities now? And what about, all of a sudden we see what I have generally thought of as the silent support for Daniel Ortega, whether the business community and the churches suddenly is sort of siding with the students. And, this seemed to me rather a quick movement in that direction. Some people say it was too slow still, but, is that really, or what are they after? In other words, is another, and basically coming to the point, is there enough of an opposition to really bring this change, reform, opening to Nicaragua?
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. And thanks all of you for being here, especially for your interest in Nicaragua. I think right now we really need special attention to Nicaragua in order to attain justice, democracy, in order to attain respect to our human rights, respect to the rule of law, and respect to our constitutions. Thank you. I really feel coming back to the dialogue like coming back home, seeing old friends like like in the 90s and the 80s received my mother, Violeta Chamorro, and my late husband, Minister Antonio Lacayo, who used to come to Washington to rebuild democracy also. At that time, from war to peace, from a totalitarian government to a democracy government, and from a state-controlled party, a state economical situation to a free economic. And now I am here again at the dialogue with the same proposal. Well, concerning to the questions that you brought up, which are very interesting, I know, well, some of you know that I'm not right now here in Nicaragua. I'm enrolled at Harvard in a program, but I had the opportunity to presently live the events that they stated on April 18 because I was there receiving the birth of my grandchild. And aside from welcoming a new member to my family, I also lived the rebirth of my own country. And I want to explain a little bit about those students' protests. I witnessed peaceful protests that, fueled by repression, became massive mobilization. I saw people cheering and dancing on the streets when they were removing the symbols of the government omnipresent and imposed power, the large, lifeless, multicolored steel streets that Ortega and his wife had laid through the streets. To me, this image, these events, were a déjà vu to the toppling of the Somoza status in the National Baseball Stadium in 1979, the day he was forced to leave power by the fury of the people. And what's next? Nobody had the answer yet, but one thing is sure about Nicaragua. Nicaragua is not the same as it was before April 18. Ortega's model is broken. The Nicaraguan people have lost their fear and regained the street, with the student as the main protagonist of this story. They started the protests expressing disapproval of social security reforms that affected pensions of all sectors alike, especially the most vulnerable. But the real protest now is not just about social security. The real protests are saying enough power abuse against our rights as Nicaraguan citizens. The country is not the same after more than 60 citizens, according to human rights organizations, being brutally killed and more than 400 wounded. Can't be the same after we live the most bloody repression with the most deadly events since the civil wars in the 80s, which took place on the first Ortega regime. And to this death, we must add, one, that it came from an already illegitimate president that was elected under constitutional terms, abolished all institutions, and committed electoral fraud, manifesting its clear dynastic pretensions. Two, that according to international transparency, the government of Nicaragua is registered as the most corrupt in Latin America after Venezuela. And now third, with this bloodbath and the mobilization following, Ortega and Murillo had been declared by most Nicaraguans as more incapable to govern. What is next? Today, very much in the same way as my father's blood, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, with his assassination in 1978, marked the end of Somoza regime, the blood in Ortega's hands have started to reshape the political space, offering some signals of hope in the middle of our national mourning. And let me point out briefly the five or more positive effects of these events of April that help us to figure out what's next. First, the suffering and courage of our students have created a national unity. It has brought consensus that a true commission must be established, ideally led by the Inter-American Commission of the Human Rights or the Organization of the American States, to make justice for the committed crimes. We reject that yesterday the government regret the support of this organization. As the Bishop Baez has said, if there is not justice, we won't have peace. At the same time, these events have created a national consensus that the first point in the agenda of any negotiation has to be Ortega's democratization, which means Ortega's departure through anticipated elections with a peaceful and orderly transition. Second, the leadership of the private sector as the main sounding board to Ortega has been replaced by the church. It has become evident that the pact of economic stability between the private sector and the government, which have helped Ortega to maintain economic growth and fiscal order at the expense of civil liberties and democracy, has been broken. The model dialogue and consensus only with the business sector has been displaced by the leadership of the Catholic Church. The bishops are now the referees who were called to lead the dialogue process in a different format, inclusive to all sectors and with complete transparency towards the entire population. And everybody are backing or endorsing the bishops with this dialogue, including the private sector. 3, signals of the international, there are some signals of international divisions within the Sandinistas party. For the first time in 10 years, advisors close to the government are publicly criticizing the regime. In an interview with Univision, one of Ortega's closest economic advisors recently said, Ortega's government expectations failed. I believe we trust that this situation will cool down faster. Along the same line, as Sandinistas congressman said, it is a fact that the Sandinistas party has to make a critical assessment and identify our mistakes. 4, there is a change of leadership among police forces. During these 10 years, the high commanders of the army and police have been subjected to the instrumentalization of Ortega's party with the complicity of its highest commanders. On several occasions, the public opinion has asked them their resignation. After the events of April 18, High Police Commissioner Aminta Granera, due to pressure from public opinion, finally resigned. Her decision expressed disagreement with the torture and excessive repression against civil population, which is being evaluated as illegal execution by the United Nations. The resignation of the High Commander ensures some distance, or at least some demoralization between the old guards and the loyal to the government. 5, international pressure. To our new national scenario, we must add how international pressure escalated in the last year. First, with the law proposed by U.S. Congress, the NICA Act, which, if approved, takes away from Nicaragua access to North American credit and aid. With the NICA Act, the government, the private sector, and generally the population now worry that Nicaragua will be rejected from the international market. It is true that because of this NICA Act law, there was a memorandum of understanding between the government and the OES, giving Ortega time to stop the NICA Act and finish its term. But after this deathbat, this memorandum of understanding is obsolete, and the OEA should review totally his approach to Nicaragua and to the government. Also, along with this pressure are the sanctions of the Magnitsky Law, which targets corrupt officials. The Magnitsky Law has already been correctly applied to Roberto Rivas, the head of the Supreme Electoral Council, and one of Ortega's closest and most protected allies. In consequences of all this, I will say that uncertainty reigns now in Nicaragua. And as a conclusion, what's next? In the short term, in the midst of this crisis, as I have said, there is a national dialogue under the leadership of the bishops and accompanied by representatives of different sectors. Naturally, there is a lot of skepticism on this process. Some believe that Ortega just wants to gain time, while many others claim there is nothing to negotiate with the repressor. The bishops already said that if in a month there is no agreement, the dialogue will be over. They also have said that their goal with this dialogue is to review the whole political system through his roots to get democracy. In the medium term, this passed through Ortega's exit. This means calling to elections as soon as possible, and with him and Rosario Murillo resigning to participate in the future. However, some believe Ortega's resignation from power is possible only if, in parallel to the dialogue, the students' protests prevail with national support. If the official of the National Army choose to be on the side of the people and not on the side of the government family, repressing their own brothers and sisters. If the private sectors shows a strong commitment that Ortega no longer represents economic stability and security. If the Sandinistas advisors to the government have the courage to publicly state that the current course of the nation has to change. If, of course, the international community supports the Nicaraguan population's demands and helps us with the OAS and United Nations to make justice, exercising a strong pressure for Nicaraguan freedom. Meanwhile, the national mourning must lead us to honor the memory of these young martyrs. Their blood cannot be in vain, and history comes back with its lessons. The situation is to a point that Ortega has two ways out based on our own history. One, live through the front door, as he did in the 90s, by anticipating free elections and facilitating an orderly and peaceful transition to democracy. Or second, live through the back door like Somoza in 1979, escalating repression and exacerbating pain and great grief in the country. Thus far, unfortunately, Ortega has chosen the second option.
Thank you very, very much. You see why we invited her.
It's clear now at next.
Let me, Manuel, I think the centerpiece of your article, or important part of it, was your call for elections as soon as possible, but to make it sort of a process that was followed the rules and regulations, and I think Cristiana has really pointed out there's a difficult set of obstacles in front of getting to elections. The 5 ifs, I guess you could call them, 5 IFs. And I guess I'd like you to talk a little about your proposal for the elections and how you sort of maneuver in that direction. What has to happen over the next days, months, to sort of arrive there?
Look, I think right now there are contesting agendas. There are some of them are not agreeing with each other. The first proposed agenda, the one that comes from the streets, is to expect Ortega's resignation immediately. The second one that we can say comes, broadly speaking, from the private sector, is to arrive at what they're calling a soft landing approach. That, let things go through a mediated process until he agrees not to run for election again in 2021, and then, have a new government, a more peaceful transition, but longer term. And when you look at the pattern, especially when you look at the nature of the political regime in Nicaragua, it's really hard to get to any of the two options at this point in time. Number one, because while Ortega has almost absolute control of political authority in the country, I mean, institutionally he owns the law. He has the Supreme Court in his hands, he has the elections commissions in his hands, he has the legislature in his hands, the police, the army. Practically, he has everything but the people demonstrating in the street, which now represent a critical mass. And that goes back to your first question. It's not students that are in the street, it's Nicaraguan youth to begin with. Because it's unfortunate that this university attendance in Nicaragua is still pretty low, under 100,000 people. So enrolling in university for a nearly 6 million population is a disgrace. But it's in general Nicaraguan youth. And it's also accompanied by, the people who were affected first at the beginning, the elderly people of the third age. In fact, the demonstrations started when Sandinista youth and the mobs started kicking people of the third age. And then that's when the youth emerged. So what has happened is that the balance of power, the real balance of power, rather than the formal power, has changed in the sense that people in the street, I don't know if they really lost their fear, but they really lost their tolerance to accept the continued level of control that Ortega has maintained, Ortega Murillo. That change in the balance of power is reconfiguring an opportunity to renegotiate power. There is no acceptance that Ortega should stay until 2021. So the question is how you're going to go that far in the next 3 years. Definitely this is likely to be a protracted conflict. I don't think that Nicaragua is going to have a political transition in the next 6 months. Daniel Ortega's strategy typically has been to buy time by confusing, fragmenting, and intimidating the opposition. Is it going to change? No. He's working to fragment the different opposition groups. I'm not sure he has succeeded, but within the private sector, there are divisions. There are divisions within the big capital that wants the soft landing, and people also with the big capital that want a more immediate transition. So the way to focus on a real future for Nicaragua is to look at the transformation of the institutions, starting with the Elections Commission, following with the Supreme Court, and reforming the independence of the police and the army. Now, that's a lengthy process, but that takes you to the legislature. Once you have a process by which you create independence in the Elections Commission, you may have an election for the legislature. The real question here is who has the bargaining power to really twist Ortega's arm to move into that direction. So Ortega is ready to get rid of Roberto Rivas. Well, we knew it was going to happen anyway. So the bargaining position is to some extent on the hands of the big capital, the church, and some other opposition groups. But the youth has a key role, not because they have political power per se at the institutional level, but because the demand they're making right now is highly legitimate, not only before the country, but the international community, which is to investigate the human rights violations. That is going to create a greater weakness on Ortega's. He cannot not let the groups in. And the facade he made of having a truth commission organized by the legislature is nothing but a payasada. So I think you're having basically a triangulated process that is cornering Daniel Ortega. On the one hand, the international demands to investigate human rights violations. On the other hand, the private sector and the church putting towards an agenda that looks at institutional reforms. And then there is a third element, which is the students in general and the population in general. Public opinion, for the first time perhaps in at least 15 years, is being taken into account. So cornering Ortega in that direction is going to have to give him fewer choices to use repression. And of course, you have at least a mob of 3,000 people who is willing to use to repress, more than the police and the army. And that's basically the current scenario and balance of power.
But how does the election, how do you get to an election? That's what I'm not so sure about. In other words, does it come out of a negotiation between Ortega and who is sitting on the other side of the table from Ortega? And what do they bring to the table? And why would Ortega agree to the, in other words, how does the process work?
We had that process in the past. Yeah. As you remember, in the 1990s, what happened was we had a lot of international pressure from the Central American countries and the Latin American countries. Of course, the United States was involved too. And also there was a resistance, a civic resistance inside Nicaragua, and where we were at war. We had the Contras. So Ortega had to sit down at that time in a dialogue that led him to surrender in some way and to call to anticipated elections because he couldn't maintain the country as it was at the time. You see? So now we are almost similarly, almost in the same situation. All Nicaragua is against him, and he has international pressure. We need more, of course, but he doesn't have a way out. And also he lost all the support from Venezuela economic support, which he has in the past and had maintained him. So he doesn't, he's not allowed to govern, and so he will end up calling for anticipate elections to live out easily or orderly, at least. Yes.
I think, from the legal standpoint, Latin Americans we are accustomed to the Carpentier's el papel aguanta todo. And I think a formal agreement on forwarding the elections could happen. I am skeptical that that's a long-term solution for Nicaragua, because it has had it before. Forwarding elections just rush a political process, and then there is not an incipient opposition, really doesn't end up consolidating its power. So perhaps the best step is to really strengthen the elections commissions first, to call for parliamentary elections that will destabilize the political establishment. You create a free and fair process by which you have legitimate elected people, even if you have Sandinistas this time, getting to the real, power cloud, which is, it might be right now no more than 20%, but, it's still there. But that will also lead to greater internal divisions within the FSLN. If you agree to forward elections in the short term, I'm not sure Ortega is willing to go for it unless he's extremely pressured. And at this point, I don't see the international community really putting a lot of pressure on Nicaragua. The OAS is definitely not your best ally. By nature of its ineffectiveness in the past. The United States, it's likely to play a key role in the issues relating to human rights violations, but less likely on issues of internal democratization developments. Therefore, the pressure has to be put into internal reforms. So you have a reformed elections commission, and then you can follow through the legislature.
Yeah, the question of international pressure is always a tough one. In other words, what we have sort of the Latin American countries are really not very willing to make any big jumps toward any kind of strong pressure. The U.S. has been hesitant, particularly because of the oil issue. And I just wonder if you mentioned pressure several times. What is your hope on that?
Besides, my trust is not on the international pressure mostly. It is on the Nicaraguan people mostly.
Yeah.
Yes. And I have said before, there is a reshaping of the scenario, of the political scenario in Nicaragua, and I trust in all that forces that I think are changing and are breaking the political model Ortega had in the past. And all those forces had got to a point that they said, stop, enough. And I feel in Nicaragua a national unity now and a consensus now that Ortega can stay more. And so, in the medium run, he won't support the pressure. And then the international comes after. But I don't want the international first. We Nicaraguans, I think, can make our own.
Yes, I think things are leading in that direction, that there is a growing opposition that is unifying, at least to common goals. The international community, there is a big difference between Nicaragua and Venezuela. Mm-hmm. So, that matters. It's not just about oil, population size, economic strength, etc. There are punctuated levels of pressure that will weaken the regime quite rapidly and drastically. One of them is sanctions to certain individuals who actually have been pivotal in sustaining the regime. The sanction of Roberto Rivas actually had a major effect, not only on the reputation of Daniel Ortega's government, but also on who's next. Since then, everybody has been jittering about who's next in the list. And if you ask in Washington, and scratch your head, who's next? I mean, people from the Social Security Institute are probably in the list. The people who participated in ordering the police going after these kids are also in the list. And a few other names in the National Assembly, the President of the Assembly, for example, that has been conspiring and talking about truth commissions when in fact, it's not. The U.S. may put some pressure along those lines, and that may have an effect. Costa Rica has actually been vocal of all countries, and make no mistake, Costa Rica, although it's not the U.S., it has had a historical critical role in putting international pressure on Nicaragua. It's not just about, Rodrigo Carazo in the 1980s, but it's also Oscar Arias in the late 80s. And more recently, the Costa Rican government has stressed its concern. It has reasons why. Every time there is a political crisis, people migrate. Look at the Northern Triangle coming to the U.S. Well, they're going to go south to Costa Rica. So the international community does have a role to play, but it will be more productive with a unified group and a common agenda. And I think that's where things are. But again, you can't expect more than that at this point.
Well, thank you. I want to open it up. I mean, a lot of people here will have very good questions, and I can see the hands already coming up. The one thing that let me just say, one worry that I would have is the ability of the various different segments of the Nicaraguan population. The business community and university students doesn't often find easy consensus. The Catholic Church and evangelicals won't find easy consensus. So that's how do you manage that, at least through an election process? Yes.
Do you know that in 1989, we had the same situation? And when the conditions were created to have a national elections on the 90, the people start organizing. So what we had to do first is to create the conditions for the people to get organized and to see the goal at the end, to change Ortega.
I think that's actually something that you ought to give more attention to.
Yes.
The experience you've had and the success in many respects. Please, just tell everybody your name and why you're not wearing a tie.
Gladly. I retired from the Inter-American Bank about 15 years ago, and I've lost all my ties, Peter. Cristiana, the press. Is La Prensa receiving pressures in one way or another, and what role does the press have to play in this whole process? Number one, if you feel that you're free to do that, and if you can be effective. And secondly, I'd love to hear your response to, given Oscar Arias' antecedente with el Acuerdo de Esquipulas, if you think that maybe Central America and maybe other Central American countries can play a role in that process.
That's a good question.
Yes, in the terms of the free press in general in Nicaragua, it had been repression over free press in all aspects. And recently with these events, Canal 100% news, it is called, was closed, and then some others were closed, and our web page and the other web page were called down, and there is also a situation that the press is repressed in general. And concerning to what you say about Oscar Arias and so, I usually see lessons in history, but history cannot be repeated. So it is, right now it's not the same thing, but of course we need support and we need attention, international attention, in order to attain justice, in order to attain civil liberties, freedom of press, and in order to get democracy again to Nicaragua.
Let me go to this side for.
Hi, I'm Paul Schenkman with U.S. News and World Report. Can you talk about, do you see this movement that's taking place right now as a rejection of just Ortega's government or of the system of government that's been in place in Nicaragua for decades? And are there any sort of regional implications we can take from that, sort of a look at or a turn away from the kinds of revolutionary governments we saw in the 60s?
Well, we were talking before we got started that currently Daniel Ortega, since 1979, is the longest standing dictator in contemporary world history. You can just check around who are the current living dictators. You're going to find someone who has been in control of politics for 40-something years or has ruled for at least 20 years. Ortega has been ruling for 21 years. So the opposition, I think it's the same thing, not just to the system of government, but also to Ortega, because the system of government that was established by Daniel Ortega. When you look at the structure, the political engineering that is currently governing the country is one by which there is the conventional institutional setting of the three powers, executive, the judiciary, and the legislative, but in the middle, there is an intervening power connected to the private sector, for example, that has a line of communication where laws are drafted before they're actually voted before Congress. Now, that's unique. It's a unique system of power, of governance that, Ortega established. The system of governance also was redesigned in 1995 and in 1999 through election and constitutional reforms. Nicaragua is one of the few countries that you can win an election with 35% of the vote as long as you have 5% differences. So, Mr. Ortega has been cleverly measuring every single number of every single inhabitant in the country by their economic and their demographic clout in order to retain as long as he can his power structure. Now, people are opposing not just to that system, but also the consequence of it, which is the enrichment of his family. His son controls the distribution of some of the gasoline coming from Venezuelan oil. The other son is in charge of, tourist investment, foreign investment. And the level of corruption that exists in the country based on the discretion that the regime allows his family to enrich themselves is going beyond limits. And it's really unfortunate. I'm a product of the Cold War. I was born in Nicaragua during the Somoza dictatorship, and I refuse to say, I will have heated arguments with colleagues that Ortega and Somoza were the same thing. And it's unfortunately, when you look at the facts, the history and all that, Ortega is becoming, and it has become worse than Somoza. He's ruled as long as the two Anastasios.
Let me take two questions from this side, this gentleman and then the lady behind him.
Yes, Cristiana, I come from a generation that lived the war in Nicaragua, and I escaped the horrors of the war. And I come from the generation in which your mother became the hope for us. I am a writer myself, and I belong to the Nicaraguan intelligentsia. And I don't see a leader coming up in all of this, which is what concerns me. Because even the intelligentsia, the academic groups, I mean, the writers, which are confronted with a repressive government, have already taken sides, most of them, or have remained silent. I mean, my concern is that, yes, I agree with you that every darn tree of life that we bring down debilitates Rosario Murillo, and that it has to come from us. But where is the next Violeta Barrios de Chamorro to lead us into the next chapter?
Let's wait till we get this out. This young lady here.
Hi. Do either of you think that there would be a benefit to...
Who are you?
My name is Daniela Chamorro.
Ah.
I just come here by myself. I don't represent anybody. Do either of you think that there's a benefit to having a junta as there was in '79? And who do you see as being a part of that today?
Okay.
Okay. Well, in relation to who's going to be the next Violeta Chamorro, I would say that we have to prepare conditions first to have a new leader and to have free elections observed by the international community and that. As I said before, nobody knows yet what's going to happen, but the real thing is that we have now a new country that we want to save at this time. And concerning to your question about the junta and new organizations about what's going on in Nicaragua, there is a lot of speculation and a lot of thoughts about alternatives that we may have. Some people see the past, read the story, but I would say that we have to live the present and see the events. And right now, the whole Nicaraguans is supporting the bishops in their dialogue, and they have said that the first goal is the democratization of Nicaragua and to change the system from its roots. So that means something that's going to happen, and if in a month there's nothing, they will retire. So we have to wait this first step to see what the others will be.
Just briefly, you're disappointing yourself by thinking there is no leadership in Nicaragua, because there is. It's not perfect. I mean, it's pretty fucked up. But that's okay. I mean, speaking of Violeta Barrios, I mean, with all due respect, she was a nobody prior to 1990. I mean, everybody just associated her as the wife of in the machisto context. But look at what happened. In fact, to Ortega, it was very pragmatic and very opportunistic to have that lady, because la podíamos manipular whichever way you wanted. So I think the lesson is we shouldn't underestimate the existing leadership that exists in there. From outside perspective, the leadership really people should be nurturing a female young leader from Nicaragua who is prepared to really lead with all the failures that they may have, the future of the country, because this country belongs to youth, belongs to women, I mean, for whatever history you want to look at, and belongs to really fairness. So look inside, because you will find quite a few characters that will be prepared to really take the country, at least in the short term.
Go ahead. Tell us who you are.
Hi, Elena Lacayo, de Nicaragua, and I've lived here for 12 years. I have a quick comment. I think my big fear is that the international community is going to want to equate us with Venezuela. And I feel like in my mind at least, there's two big distinctions. One is that we don't have as deep a pocket, so we don't have as long of a leash or give. And then the other thing is that we've seen revolutions triumph in Nicaragua, and that's a history that some of the people in my generation didn't live, but we know the effects of it. My question to you is that the group of us that are here organizing in Washington, D.C., we want to know, I mean, me personally, I wasn't part of the resistance in the 70s and 80s, and so I wanted to know what advice you would have for us who are trying to support Nicaraguans in Nicaragua, but from Washington, D.C. Thank you.
We'll get to that. Jeff?
Thanks. I'm Jeff Thale from WOLA. Two follow-up questions on leadership in the opposition. I've heard, sort of in relation to the national dialogue, that students are going through a process of trying to organize themselves and select leadership to participate in the national dialogue, and I'd be curious to know how you think that process of organization is going and its challenges. That's the one. Then the other side, it really strikes me that the reality is Daniel has a continuing core of support, both ideological and economic, because of some of the social programs and so on. And so I guess one of the challenges seems to me to what extent an opposition movement is going to try and peel away pieces of that base, particularly around some of the social issues.
You want to try those two?
I think maybe he answered the second one and I answer.
Okay,
yes,
that's great.
Yes.
Manuel will want to do both of them, I'm sure.
Okay, one, two.
That's my agent.
No, my recommendation or my advice to the Nicaraguan community is to maintain the attention to Nicaragua. Do not forget Nicaragua. Nicaragua is yours, and here, part of Nicaragua, the soul of Nicaragua is here, and so maintaining international attention, we will get a lot of things inside Nicaragua. And if you can get organized and help the Nicaraguan students with your support and your knowledge, that will be great too. Yeah.
I think, Jeff, there is a chance that in the short term, I mean, look, I don't think there is going to be an election process in the next 2 years. Knowing Ortega, how he has ruled for the past 40 years, you can see that his strength is in delay. Push things as far as you can. So making concessions will not lead to that. But what's going to happen is that the dissidence that Cristiana is talking about is going to continue to grow. That dissidents may not want to go to, the dissident party, the MRS. But they will push for more reforms, to the direction of the reforms. So I think that's where things may head, more in terms of political realignment, party realignment, at least in the short term. We'll see, you may have a renewed FSLN. It happened with the FMLN. Right now the FMLN is in a big crisis because they refuse to have that renewal. So, maybe the Sandinistas could learn from the lessons of El Salvador. And just, as a Nicaraguan in Washington, I don't think myself as Nicaraguan for some reasons of, the experience of having the reasons why I left the country, et cetera, et cetera. But, visibility is the key element. Making as much noise as possible about what is happening in the country, letting people know, and just let the facts speak for themselves. And the other thing is let Nicaraguans know that there is an outside voice in Nicaragua, outside of Nicaragua speaking, because people feel empowered by that, legitimated by the voices from outside.
The gentleman in orange, hold on. And then you're next.
Jack Martin. I headed the political section in Managua in the U.S. Embassy from 76 to 79. So I was friends with Cristiana's parents. And in thinking about the Nicaraguan situation, there's a tendency to want to compare the situation today with Ortega controlling all of the levers of power, with Somoza controlling all of the levers of power coming up to the end of the revolution. But it's important to focus on what the differences are. The differences were there was a Sandinista movement which was giving a military challenge, which was feeding into the international socialist movement and human rights movement that was creating a lot of pressure on Somoza. And the United States was actively involved in trying to convince Somoza to step down or to hold elections. And there is not that same role for the United States, certainly with regard to Ortega, and there is nobody similarly putting that same kind of pressure on Ortega at the present time. So I think those differences tend to suggest a certain amount of discouragement from the ability to move Ortega in the same way that Somoza was moved to eventually leave power.
This gentleman here, the one with the tie.
Getting back to what you mentioned on the inefficiency and the ineffectiveness of the OAS, given that it's a key player in the region, what would be an advice, what is the kind of pressure that we could exercise so that, for instance, the Secretary General of the OAS really exercise pressure on the members of the OAS and on the Nicaraguan government? What is something specifically we could do, or what is something that the members of this Inter-American dialogue could also do?
Let me get one more question from here. There, people are getting. This gentleman here with the camera.
My name is Edmundo, and I am from Nicaragua. And I was just wondering about this famous dialogue. I don't know if is this the only way or the best way to resolve the problems in Nicaragua. I don't know which are the sectors that will be taking place in this dialogue, and I don't know if you have a date when it will take place, the dialogue. Thank you.
Which one do you want to take?
In reference to your question about the OAS, right now we Nicaraguans would like them to totally forget the memo of understanding that they have with the government and start listening what the Nicaraguans are saying and start its dialogue with the Nicaraguan people and also with transparency with the Nicaraguan people, because all what they have done has been quite secretly, no? And so they have to review the whole approach to Nicaragua, and first of all, to send the Commission of Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, they must send it immediately to find out about the crimes committed.
Yes, I mean, right now the United States ambassador to the OAS is pushing a group of countries, Argentina, Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, pretty likely Colombia, to make a statement about, at the very least, to investigate the human rights abuses and have the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. That's one likely scenario that is going to happen in the short term. There are other things that will likely happen within the OAS. What it's going to do is to give some emboldening to the Secretary General to push for something. Now, the OAS will have limitations. The presence of the OAS after the elections was a failure. The Secretary General thought he could deal with Mr. Ortega. And again, that brings the question about dialogue. It is true. I mean, Ortega, as you saw the video, he is very clear. It's okay to listen. That's what dialogue is based on. That doesn't mean I'm going to do something about it. That's the afterthought that stays in his head. And he has proven right to do so. However, the Catholic Church is not an expert in negotiations or in mediations, even though they've been called over and over. But they are somewhat in a position that they have been advised to really be careful about two things. One is what Ortega is doing right now in putting noise into the table, adding names, organizations to have equal size of numbers just to destabilize the discussion. They are filtering that. Second, the agenda. The agenda will be presented by the church, not by the government. And the one thing that is not set is the date. And I think the date is basically something that will be commonly agreed. There is a a delay in part from the students who want to agree to a common goal, etc. But there is also a delay on the part of the government that is also, trying to push as far as they can the discussion. But at this point, short of going back to the streets and deal with violence of the mobs, the open dialogue is the next step. Plus, I think some sanctions may have an effect too. Well, on the side of the opposition, on the side of the group that is being sitting there, the immediate one is the private sector, COSEP. There is also a think tank, FUNIDES. And then there are other groupings that are being called upon. Civil society organizations and the student movement, the April 19 movement. Those are some of the groups that will be sitting at the table.
Let me say that sounds very confusing. I mean, in other words, that each of those groups bring a particular set of interests, set of values, history. And, when you generally talk about a dialogue is two groups that are, that have differences, and you try to find a way out of them. Here you have, and the government would seem to have every advantage in a situation like that. Is that wrong?
You're totally correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's why it's a lot of skepticism about the dialogue.
Right. And, not about this dialogue, about the dialogue.
No, not this one, not at all, yes.
Let's go to the center. Please, you start us off here at the center. This is the moderate group.
Thank you. My name is Sue Owen. I'm just here independently. But I have strong ties to Central America and specifically Honduras is a second home. And I see the status of insecurity and violence and activity going on in Honduras. And I spend time in Nicaragua and I don't see the same. And I reflect on how the Honduran situation became much worse after their upheaval and crisis. And I'd like people's reflection on what is the thinking about Nicaragua not only coming through this crisis, but coming through it without the lingering after effects of a instability like you see in Honduras.
Peter, you okay, please.
Hi, I'm Richard Bowden. I'm a student at the George Washington University. I've lived in Costa Rica, I've been to Nicaragua many times, and actually I have many good friends of mine who are demonstrating in Managua right now. I'm curious if you could talk a bit. You both spoke about the need for institutional reforms, be it the Electoral Commission, inside the police. I'm curious if you could talk about the willingness of the people inside these institutions. Do they share the same sentiments, or are they not willing to reform because the current system benefits them? Thank you.
Let's go to this gentleman who's standing.
My name is Javier Arguello. I'm not wearing a tie because I don't have any political ties. And my question is to each of you regarding the comments that you made before. I think that Nicaraguan politics is a game of exponential cynicism, and it leads to one in which there's an elephant in the room that we rarely discuss. And your second point, Cristiana, referenced the loss of credibility that the private sector has had in the rise of corruption in the country. They have explicitly participated and benefited from the economic corruption as democratic institutions destroy themselves, right? So they're not credible participants in a dialogue if they don't want to be caught in bed with Ortega. That means that the economic and political leadership in the country is not representing the voice of the rest of the country that represents maybe 1% of the wealth. So your second point alluded to that, and the fifth point was about the Magnitsky Act and the NICA Act, which have coincidentally been lobbied against by the private sector of Nicaragua. They were paying a lobby group here called Carmen Group as of 10 days ago in order to block the rule of law in Nicaragua. So this is the elephant in the room that I'd like you to maybe discuss a little more, in the sense like, to what extent is the private sector complicit in the destruction of democracy and the rise of corruption? And to Manuel Orozco's point about the OAS having discredited itself, it has, but maybe that's why it's they are our ally, because I think the world knows that they have not been effective, and if they want to stay alive, this is an opportunity to show that they can be credible. So the last point I'll make is, in 2 weeks, we're hosting an event on May 21st with the Secretary General of the OAS to ask him these questions. He'll be speaking at George Washington University. We're inviting a leader from a Nicaraguan movement, Felix Manadiaga, and a theologian. So those are...
No more advertisements.
There are many questions on the floor.
There's a lot of questions out here.
The first one is relating to Nicaraguan security. Of course, Nicaragua has been sold as the most security place in Central America, and we have enjoyed that security, really. But right now, everybody worries about that beautiful situation we had in the past, because Ortega and his government is not offering security anymore. And the Nicaraguan people is concerned that this has been changed. And we are worried about what's going to happen. And of course, well, we want to save our country. In relation to what's going on inside the institutions, inside Ortega's institutions, well, myself, I don't know, but I know that the people in some of the institutions are trapped on it. And they are like clients. They feel that they have to be, but once the things change, I think they will support a change for democratization. And in relations to the situation of the private sector and the government, as I said at the beginning, well, this model has been broken. Has been broken because it is not supported by the people anymore. And of course, the model was at the cost of the democratic system and the stability, not the stability in Nicaragua, because it was a pact of stability, economic stability. And now there is a new leadership, and another leadership that people is trusting on them. So I think, and the private sector have agreed to lead the leadership to the bishop, sorry. This is from Nicaragua. To the bishop. So there is a change already on the landscape.
Let me talk about the elephant in the room, because I've been trying to get inside their heads, not their business. There are substantive divisions within the group as to in which direction to go. I think it's. Let me start with this. I think you're being too reductionist to say, they just benefited from the corruption. There are definitely benefits along the lines in the process. But again, my argument is that they are the key political actor, even though they're not formally a political player. And you're right, there is a division within the PELAS group, for example, and other sectors that want an alternative solution. So you see, for example, the Communicate from the Private Sector Enterprise group that is pretty much more along the lines of a gradual transition, but secure. There is a inside narrative within the group too that wants a long-term solution, a long-term salida, exit for Ortega. And that's where there is a clash of perspectives. There is a moral hazard that they are dealing with, and if they were to break it and take on the risk to have a political transition, the transition will happen much rapidly. Because I think the way currently things are, Ortega, there are two major power sources he doesn't have a hold on. The Nicaraguan population, at least the majority of it, and a significant sector of the private sector, at least those who are not in the hands of the economic Sandinista elite. This group is divided, and what they want to do is put their weight onto the church. So the responsibility is falling into the church right now, and it's hard. That's what, my perspective as to why this is going to be a protracted conflict is precisely because the private sector is not going to throw the towel inside the ring to fight. They see lots of things at stake. One of them is they're going to lose money. The news media is already showing that they're having economic losses. I think the losses are exaggerated, but they're saying, look, we're having losses so we can have more violence. That brings the question of Honduras. I do think the Nicaraguans are actually having a very, very mature reflection about violence in Nicaragua, because they know what it looks like, what the rest of the region looks like. And make no mistake, Nicaragua is not a violent, Nicaragua is a violent place. It's one of the countries that has the highest levels of sexual harassment and rape in the world. So there are no homicides like in the other countries, but that's also associated to why organized crime networks operate in Nicaragua. So the resistance right now is quite measured. People don't want blood to spill it for the sake of blood. And it's actually a very mature process that is taking place that distinguishes Nicaragua of today from the time of Somoza. So when you put these things together, again, what is giving you the picture is a protracted conflict. Because people are not prepared to go into put dead bodies or to have major economic losses in the short term. It is a paradox because the weakness of Ortega lies precisely on those two elements.
Let me just ask, you say protracted conflict, Manuel. Perhaps, that the opposition isn't really ready to take on the government now, and that they ought to spend some time organizing themselves and getting some basic directions. I mean, ask anybody, who are the leaders of in other words, nobody's name sort of pops out immediately. So maybe they should back off a little bit and organize themselves.
The opposition exists. I mean, the political parties in opposition to the Sandinistas are ready to move on into major transformations. However, Daniel Ortega has controlled them. He eliminated parties and individuals in order to weaken a legitimate opposition. So you have two oppositions, the puppetry opposition that is in the Legislative Assembly and the political opposition that is outside. But the leaders are there. I think they're not asking for time to organize themselves. There is impatience as to why they are not already negotiating the way out for Ortega. But their power position is really weak.
Please. Okay.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Castillo. I'm from Nicaragua, and I've been living here for 1 year. My question is, we're talking about Nicaragua needs to be organized, and we need a leader as soon as possible, but does Nicaragua need a new party or just rebuild the opposition? Because we know what happened or how Ortega destroyed the opposition in Nicaragua, and now students are saying they are not representing any parties that we have in Nicaragua. So in this case, do we need a new party with a new leader and people can trust this new party, or just rebuild the liberal opposition that is in Nicaragua? Thank you.
Why don't you just pass it to this?
Good morning. My name is Ariana Gutierrez. My question is, I believe that students are still going to go out in the streets asking for their rights, to have a better Nicaragua. After the dialogue happens, if Daniel Ortega does not bring a solution and say that the country is going to be democratic and that he's going to make huge changes for the country, people are still going to go out to the streets and they are going to still be killed and they're going to still be repressed. How can we do, or what can we do to absolutely stop that? To stop the violence and the killings and the deaths that we do not want anymore.
One last question. The gentleman who hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah. John Swallow is my name, and I'm retired from USAID. In fact, I was in Nicaragua from 1977 to 81 and was only back there, I guess, 2013 doing a youth assessment for the Atlantic Coast. all this talk of activism and leadership and opposition, and I'm wondering, there's been no mention of organized or semi-organized labor. Is there any hope, or are there some rules for, say, the teachers union or agricultural cooperatives or groups or other labor unions?
Already? Well,
I think this is going to be the last round of questions, so you can use it to sort of end up with any of your own thoughts.
Concerning to the question about if we have to create a new party and a new leader, as Manuel said, we have parties in Nicaragua and we have leaders in Nicaragua. But as I said before, we have to create the conditions for them to raise again, because right now the system has put it in them down. And I think that when we have the conditions after this process, we will get that. And in relation to what's going to happen and the scenario that you brought up, that's a scenario that we don't know yet, and we are not there yet. So what we have to analyze is where we are now and what is happening, and in terms of what is happening to support the process in that way, and then we will see what's the next step. And maybe you answer the one of the labor.
Yeah, look, remember Nicaragua, nearly 80% of the labor force is in the informal economy. So for a country of, a labor force of 3 million people, you're talking about maybe 500,000 people actually formally enrolled. At least 100,000 then are working for the government. And then there is, I think it's about 5% union membership in the country. And they are predominantly because not entirely, controlled by the Sandinista Workers' Union. That workers' union is actually controlled by another hierarchic structure that responds to Rosario Murillo. So I wish we could talk about labor movements like in other places, especially teachers' unions like Honduras. People, you talk about Honduras, you despise the unions in Honduras for other reasons. But at least they have one, a legitimate one. In Nicaragua, you have basically paid people in the payrolls for political reasons. So this is one of the major weaknesses in the country, that social and political organizing in Nicaragua is pretty restricted by the nature of society itself, with a highly informal economy and with a very narrow circle of political power along few elites. So organizing is really restricted to a few names. And, whether you're in the opposition or in the Sandinistas, you're going to see a short list of no more than 25 names. And the names are familiar, and they are familiar, too, among each other. So it's really, it makes it difficult when you talk about new political parties. That's why, the ideal idea is to actually have a female leader that comes from the ground, a single mother that knows what it's like to be living in a country where, life is...
Yeah, we have a lot of
women. Yeah. I don't want to end this session, but let me just say we're coming to the end. And Cristiana, if you have some last words that you want to use, give your impression of the questions and grade them, or if you like. And Manuel as well, you'll get your chance.
Well, first of all, thank you again for being here and for your attention to Nicaragua. Please keep on attention to attain justice, to attain civil freedom, to attain democracy, and to get our respect to the constitutions and the rule of law. To close this, I like to say only that please have hope on Nicaragua. We have to have hope always, because the Nicaraguan people is looking for a transformation, is looking for a new situation. So we have to support that hope. Maybe we can see now where is the light out of the tunnel. But if we have hope and if we maintain our positions that we deserve democracy, that we deserve peace, and that we deserve the rule of law, we will get it soon.
I think, thank you, Peter and Cristiana. I think we agreed on a lot of these issues. There is one critical aspect to realize, is that what you can call the political demonstrations and social resistance or social demonstrations represented a breaking point in April. But they've been mounting almost since the day that Eduardo Montealegre was nullified from elections. From that point on, there has been growing disaffection moving up that led to the failure of the OAS, then led to the NICA Act, the proposal of the NICA Act that led to Roberto Rivas in the list, then the resistance of individuals in Nicaragua, especially youth, about the threat of censorship of social media in the country. And then just days in between, the mismanagement and the mistreatment of the Indio Maíz, the protected area of Nicaragua. And right after that comes the pension crisis. So this is something that has been mounting on and that has reached a level of no resilience for Nicaraguans. So the next stage is really a critical one that it depends substantially on how those groups in the lead are prepared to move the country in the right direction. I am realistically hopeful that the country will move in that direction. That means that the days of Ortega, the years of Ortega are probably counted. The question is there going to be justice to several of the atrocities and the corruption levels that exist in the country? Or you have to just move forward and just do tabula rasa. But a transition has started in Nicaragua, and the question now is, who is going to be able to shape that transition in the right way? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
When are you coming back?
Coming back here? At Nicaragua or here?
Here.
Here.